Welcome to the Creative Me podcast. Coming to you from Guernsey in the Channel Islands. This is episode 45, 7 top tips for teaching online. Hello and welcome to episode 45 of the Creative Me podcast. Today we're talking about teaching online. Now, teaching online means a whole host of different things, and there are lots of people teaching online today. I'll give you an example. If you write a blog and you have tutorials on that blog, perhaps they're photo-based or video-based, you're teaching. You might have a YouTube channel where you do makeup tutorials. That's teaching. You might, like me, produce online courses, or you might have a podcast where you share information that people go off and implement. That's teaching as well. It's all teaching. I just think it's important to highlight the fact that all of this is teaching rather than just sharing information. Because if you don't think of it as teaching, then you run the risk of getting it entirely wrong. I feel I'm on the cusp of a rant. Do we feel a rant coming on? No, I'm not going to rant. I'm not going to moan. Rather than do that, I thought I'd share 7 top tips today from my perspective as a teacher to help people teach online in the most effective way possible. Now, bear in mind, we're covering a whole host of different teaching methods, from video to tutorials and that sort of thing. So the tips are quite general, but hopefully they'll be helpful to you if you are teaching online already or it's something you've thought about doing. Right, let's get started. Here are my 7 top tips for teaching online. Number 1, start with the end in mind. What are your learners going to be able to achieve by the end of your tutorial or your video? When I create an online course, I have an aim for the course and then I have some objectives. The aim of the course is an overall statement of intent about what will be achieved in that course. So what is the learner going to achieve? And the objectives are the steps the learner takes to get to the aim. So your objectives often create a bit of structure for whatever learning experience is going to happen. And also, if I was doing a taught session in my local college or a workshop or something like that, there would also be an element of assessment relating to those objectives. So I would be assessing the learners to see whether they'd achieved the objectives. Now, when you're teaching online, it's a one-to-many experience, and the assessment element of teaching and learning is quite difficult to achieve. But we'll touch on that in a minute, because I believe that self-assessment is really easy to do if you're teaching online. Top tip number 2. Use simple, straightforward language. Explain any industry jargon you might use in general conversation when you're explaining what it is you're teaching. So, for example, if you're a knitting instructor and you're teaching beginners, don't use phrases like, I'm a big fan of brioche knitting, because as far as learners are concerned, or beginners when it comes to knitting, brioche is a cakey bread type thing which is nice to eat. They don't know that it's a type of knitting. If you are going to be introducing quite a few industry type jargon terms, then think about having some sort of handout that's a glossary or a word bank that people can refer to. If you're teaching online, if it's a tutorial, what about a downloadable glossary? That would be a great idea. Top tip number 3, if you're using photos in your teaching, so if you're doing a photo-based tutorial, for example, make sure your photos are extremely well lit and cropped appropriately. If that's the main way people are going to see how to do what you're teaching them, then those photographs need to be as good as having you physically in front of them showing them what to do. The same, of course, applies to video. Lighting is essential, and if there's audio attached to it, then make sure your audio is the best quality you can manage. Tip number 4, people love handouts and printables and workbooks and all that stuff. So if you can create that sort of thing to go with whatever it is you're teaching, I highly recommend it. Canva.com is an amazing free tool that I've mentioned before that you can really easily produce handouts using Canva with minimal knowledge or experience. So it's definitely worth having a play. Tip number 5. Now, I touched upon assessment earlier. Assessment is essentially what you do in a classroom, for example, to check that learning had taken place. So remember we said we set our objectives for our online course or whatever the learning experience was. You would assess your learners to see whether they'd met the objectives. So, when you were at school, an assessment could have been exams, or it could have been just a question and answer session with the teacher, something like that. It's really tricky to bring assessment into online teaching, but what I would recommend is trying to introduce a way that your learner can self-assess to see whether they have achieved the aim of whatever it was you were teaching. So, for example, if you've done an online course, I'll give the example of my Inbox Zero course, Achieve Inbox Zero. At the end of that, there is a quiz to check that the learner has picked up on all the key points of the delivery. Clearly, with a course called Achieve Inbox Zero, the assessment element of the course would be, has the learner emptied their inbox and are they using the Inbox Zero processing system ongoing? It's really hard for me to check that, but what I do is make sure that the learner gets an email sometime after they've completed the course to check in and see if they're actually doing what they learnt how to do. Tip number 6 is to be engaging and motivational. If your teaching is text-based and image-based, then get your personality across in your images and your writing. Be clear, be concise, but you also have to engage and motivate. That's essential. Don't be someone other than yourself. Just be a great version of yourself. If you try and put on a kind of teacher persona, particularly if you're on video, then that's going to come across. People want to see you, but they want an engaging and motivational version. So be engaging, be motivational, but be you. Finally, number 7, plan, plan, plan. When I started teaching in a further education college environment, I think the biggest shock to the system for me was the level of planning that went into delivering just 1 hour's worth of teaching. Remember I came from a high-level finance job where most of the stuff I was doing was kind of fly by the seat of your pants type stuff. Teaching just requires a phenomenal level of planning, and I appreciate that teaching face-to-face in an FE environment might be slightly different to writing an online tutorial, but nevertheless the planning is still crucially important. If you are writing a tutorial on how to do something, you need to break it into manageable bite-sized chunks. You need to think about, each stage the learner has to go through. How will they know that they've actually done what you expect them to do? You need to cater for lots of different learning preferences. You've got some people who are visual, some who like written instructions. If you're creating a video, there's a massive amount of visual planning that goes into that too, as well as thinking about what you're going to say, when you're going to say it. So probably the biggest thing to make sure you get right to be an effective online teacher is to do your homework, do your planning, make sure you're covering everything that you need to in order for your learner to learn. So those are my top tips for teaching online. Clearly, I've only scratched the surface. There is a lot more to teaching online than just these 7 points. However, they're a really, really great starting point. Well, that's it from me today. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. You'll find the show notes at martinellis.com/45. Thanks for listening. I hope you'll tune in next week.